going to start the recording. And now it's my pleasure to welcome again everyone to the traffic safety webinar sponsored by the North Carolina Governor's Highway Safety Program. This is one in a series of webinars addressing topics of interest for the North Carolina's traffic safety professionals. And of course, other professionals who are joining us outside North Carolina. We appreciate you joining us today. This series is co-hosted by the Institute for Transportation Research and Education at North Carolina State University and the University of North Carolina Highway Safety Research Center. Today's topic is human behavior and road safety. It's going to be presented by Bevan Kirley, Wes Kumfer, and Gelinne with the UNC Highway Safety Research Center. Bevan is a senior research associate at HSRC. Her research interests and experience include occupant protection, young driver safety, and motorcyclist safety, with a primary focus on the behavioral side of transportation safety. Wes is an engineering research associate, also with HSRC, where he focuses on crash analysis and safety education. And Wes has expertise in crash model development, systematic safety analysis, and training program assessment. And then Gelinne is a senior research associate at HSRC, and he currently serves as program manager for the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center, where he performs research, web management, project oversight, and technical support services. And Dan also manages the Road Safety Academy, which is the training arm of HSRC. So now I'd like to introduce Wes to go ahead and share the screen and begin the presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to this webinar. As Eugene mentioned, I am Wes Kumfer, and I am going to be kicking off our introduction on human behavior and road safety. So today we're going to be talking about human factors, principles of human behavior, how to change behavior, and developing interventions. Hopefully this will provide some insight to you as far as how it is that we can go about designing successful road safety interventions that think beyond the typical go-to projects and messaging campaigns that we do. So one thing I like to address is why exactly do we need to know about human factors and human behavior when we're dealing with road safety? We often hear that 94% of crashes are caused by human error. This statistic that you have probably heard at every conference you've gone to, every webinar you've attended, it's frequently trotted out. It comes from a NHTSA study that was looking at some of the different causal factors that overlap that overlap crash causation. And what they found was that in about 94%, it seems that human error or driver behavior was a contributory factor. And what this has frequently led to in analyses of traffic safety and intervention design is this idea that if we can just eliminate human error, we could probably solve traffic safety, right? That's sort of the conclusion that gets brought up whenever anyone is talking about this 94% of human error. And so what this can end up leading to is a very siloed approach to traffic safety interventions, where if our main focus is on adjusting those road user factors, then we really don't need to deal as much with the roadway or environmental factors or those vehicular factors. We might instead focus on changing driver behavior, changing those things that are causing people to make mistakes behind the wheel. And you've probably heard any dozen of those different things that could contribute to human error. So like distraction, speeding, if someone is drinking and driving, if someone is impaired in some other method, if someone is sleeping, these are all different elements that pop up in this idea of road user factors. And so if that is true, why can't we just educate people? Why can't we just make them more aware of the problems that they're engaging in when they drive? And then hopefully that will reduce that 94%. At least that is the sort of conclusion that we come to when we discuss traffic safety in this method. And in fact, this is a lot of what the current literature that surrounds automated vehicles is addressing, is this idea that, well, if humans make so many mistakes behind the wheel, then we need automated vehicles to take over for human drivers and eliminate those mistakes. However, I think that this quotation, or that 94% statistic, is a bit misunderstood, and it's often misapplied. Really, a quotation from NHTSA's own report is that the critical reason, which is the last event in the crash causal chain, was assigned to the driver in 94% of the crashes, meaning that it's not the only thing that's happening. It's not the ultimate indicator of traffic safety problems. And in fact, it may only be a small contributor. It could be something that ties into the severity of your crash. It could be something that ties into maybe the kind of crash that occurred, but it isn't the only problem, and it's not the only thing that we need to address. And really, what we need to think about when we're dealing with human factors and human behavior is that human error interacts with other causal factors to produce crashes when latent risk exists. And when I'm talking about latent risk, what I'm talking about is this overlapping envelope of environmental factors, of vehicular factors, of land use development, of engineering, of planning, of everything else that can make it very unsafe whenever some of these lapses occur, or even if those lapses don't occur. And in fact, most of us probably multiple mistakes a day if we were to drive. You go out, you maybe speed a little bit, you maybe slow a little bit too slowly, or whenever you're approaching a stop sign. Maybe you accelerated a little bit too aggressively. These are all things that could potentially be considered driver error, and yet they don't result in crashes because perhaps they're not occurring where there is a high latent risk. But it is worth at least considering these systemic elements that overlap that we may not be able to address with our engineering countermeasures, or sorry, with our campaigns. We may want to try to address these with engineering countermeasures or planning, or find the different technologies that may deal with some of these risks that pop up in the environment. And so some of these could be things such as your regional development plans, your performance measures, how it is that you're going about organizationally trying to identify locations for treatment. So I would say that a better way to approach dealing with our traffic safety analysis and the way that we are attempting to improve safety for people is to look at this as an overlapped envelope where that latent risk occurs. So we can't pull out the road user factors without also acknowledging how the roadway or environment sends cues to people, and without also acknowledging how the vehicle can contribute to or protect people from severity. So for an example in each of these, a road user factor, again, as I said, may be speeding. However, maybe someone is speeding because the roadway environment has been overbuilt and allows them to speed. An example of that could be a 4-lane collector or minor arterial that has a center turn lane that has very wide lanes, at least 12 feet and maybe wider, and maybe it was over-designed. Maybe it doesn't carry the capacity that was intended to because there was a mismatch between the land development and the engineering, and therefore it leads to people speeding on this roadway. So now not only do we have speeding that is part of driver behavior, but it's also induced by a lack of visual friction or a lack of other traffic on that roadway. And then if that vehicle were to collide with someone, it could lead to a very severe injury. And that could be both to the person inside the vehicle if they're not wearing a seatbelt, or if they're driving an older vehicle that doesn't have airbags. So that would be a vehicle factor. Or you might consider it when a heavy SUV that has a very high kinetic energy because of its height, its weight, and its profile colliding into a pedestrian. That could be also a vehicle factor as far as the type of vehicle that applies into it. And so I think we really can't parse all these out together if we want to design effective road safety interventions. So why do we need human factors, and what do we mean by that? Well, human factors is an applied scientific discipline that tries to enhance the relationship between devices and systems. And since we've been talking about traffic safety as a system and not each of these separate parts, then we need to understand how it is that humans interact with that system. And so there are a variety of different physical performance things that we as humans need whenever we are dealing with the roadway. So one of these could be our visual acuity. This deals in some ways with the ability to read information on road signs. An example of how this might create risk is if you have a road sign with critical information, but the letters are too small, perhaps it could cause someone who is driving along the roadway at a speed that maybe is a little bit faster than they should be going at to miss the sign and very quickly overcorrect. And when they realize that they've missed their exit, and try to get off the exit and cause a crash that way. There's an interaction there between our human factors and uh, the way the built environment works. There's also contrast sensitivity, our ability to pick up on things like painting or striping, worn edge lines, or curbs, and this could be especially problematic at dusk. Frequently, whenever you hear about collisions with pedestrians especially, you'll often see it framed in the media as being pedestrian was crossing this roadway at night, they were wearing dark clothing, and the vehicle operator did not see them. Well, I think whenever we see that kind of headline, whenever we start to think about, okay, how would I address that traffic safety problem? Maybe my gut instinct would be to say, well, we need to educate pedestrians not to walk around at night. But maybe what we really need to think about is, why was that pedestrian crossing in that location in the first place? Why was visibility limited there? Why have we not granted access to where this pedestrian may need to cross on their shift coming home from work? Why wasn't the striping or retroreflectivity there strong enough to help the driver stay in their lane? There are a number of questions that we should ask regarding uh, the way that vehicles collide, the way that vehicles navigate the roadway, especially in the dark, and especially where they can come into conflict with pedestrians and bicyclists. We also want to think about motion detection, our ability to especially judge speed and gaps. This is an important one for any crossing maneuvers. I've already mentioned pedestrian needs a couple of times, but there are just tons and tons of collisions between vehicles and trains at grade crossings. And in fact, some recent studies have been done of light rail in Florida that have shown that there are a lot of safety problems relating to light rail. And some of this is because of a mismatch between the built environment and where that light rail is and with vehicles trying to get through. So if someone is trying to cut a gap, that light rail is coming. I think this should lead us to this question of, why did we have an at-grade crossing at that location in the first place, where someone can come to the railroad and maybe misjudge that gap and then not make it across? I think we need to, whenever we're encountering these situations where we're like, why was this person here? Let's question why that type of crossing, why that type of facility was there in the first place. And then I'll also mention that visual search and scan, and this also applies to drivers, driving along the road and seeing pedestrians or bicyclists or not seeing them in this case. And I think all of this comes down to this idea that driving it and crossing the street, interacting with the roadway in any way, is a very cognitively demanding endeavor. We expect people to be 100% perfect, and we design the road for people who are always going to follow the rules at the height of their cognitive and physical abilities. And yet that's just not the case. We have a system that is very demanding on your mental load, that requires you to keep track of a number of different risks and to maybe interact with the system when you're not at your peak, when you're tired, when you are distracted. And I think it's worth calling out here that that distraction can be a bit of a red herring, I would say. Yes, I do think that pedestrians, that drivers, that people are distracted on the roadway, and I do think that cell phones do cause some distraction. But we all have degrading attention spans over time, and I don't think it's the only issue that's coming up. And so I think when we're, again, trying to address our interventions for traffic safety, we need to acknowledge that maybe the built environment is interacting with this person. Maybe their social systems are interacting with them, causing them to want to pick up their cell phone in the first place. Maybe they're responding to an email past work hours. They're very tired, and they're engaging with a system that has brought a vulnerable road user into their path. I think it's worth considering, maybe distraction isn't the thing we need to address. Maybe it's those latent risks that can make that distraction so deadly in the moment that we need to address. And so ultimately, this should bring us to this consideration of human factors in design. Well, we already account for some of these human factors, things like our perception reaction time of 2.5 seconds, or using our high contrast black and yellow striping whenever we're putting out our roadway markers. But we also need to try to think about how we can change the way humans use the road. And this is something that my co-speakers are going to be talking about after this slide. But we could try to change the person. We could try to educate them. We could try to build their skills. And in some cases, that may actually help. I do think there are situations where providing someone with a bit more knowledge, with a bit more skills, could be beneficial. And Bevan will talk about that a little bit more. We could try to provide bridging tools, and I think this is also important. An example of that might be to provide ramps at all crosswalks so that disabled pedestrians who are in wheelchairs could still cross the street safely and quickly and efficiently without any added risk. But a better way to go about doing this might be to consider how we could change the way the world is designed. So address these locations with latent risk and understand why humans behave the way they do. And what I want to do before I hand it over to Dan is to acknowledge that human factors do not equal human behavior. The two are interlinked, and we need to understand human factors and how they interact with the roadway environment. But those are not necessarily the way that we always expect human behavior to pan out. So I'm going to hand it over to Dan now.
All right, thanks Wes very much. I appreciate that. It's a nice lead into the section I'm going to get into now. I wanted to unpack a few principles behind human behavior and how people operate that are really going to set us up well for understanding how we can develop interventions and solutions that are the most effective. So I'm going to walk through each of these now, but first, we're guided by two systems, human beings are. We're often irrational in our decision making. We are influenced by our environments very heavily. And then finally, we make mistakes. And all these were touched on in Wes's piece, but I'll go through each of them now. The first is that two systems that we know of guide human behavior. And we can package these into our deliberative systems, which, this is a conscious system where we consider all available information. And we use logic and rational thought and reasoning to make a decision. So you might think of something like planning a route in advance. You're going to think through all the factors and then come up with something that really works for you, or possibly purchasing a vehicle if you're a person who really likes to deliberate and take time doing this and thinking about all those factors that go into it. Deliberative decision-making is part of human nature, but we also do a lot of intuitive decision-making. This makes up the bulk of our decision-making on a regular basis. These are implicit and unconscious decisions. They're made instantaneously, typically. We think of our gut instinct. So you might consider a situation where you react to an animal, a deer or something running across you in the street. Or if you're making a decision, maybe you're turning left across oncoming traffic, you're judging a gap and probably quickly just going to make that turn, possibly. You do this a lot, it becomes routine. You tend to use your intuition to do it. So you might think of the deliberative system as possibly something like a, whoops, I've jumped out of my slide here. Excuse me, folks. Let me get back here. Sorry, Wes, I seem to have lost control of the screen here. Wes, I'm going to request control from you one more time. Sorry, guys, I'm not able to interact with the screen on Wes's end.
Dan, we may have lost a connection to Wes.
Okay. Here's what I'll do. I actually have the slides up. Maybe oh, have you got it? Maybe I can pull the slides up on my end and we can get right back into it. Think that'll work?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. Let me just get this together here. All right.
Thanks everyone for your patience.
Yeah, sorry everybody. It'll be worth the wait, I promise. Okay, hopefully you can see that same slide now. I've got it up. We were talking about the deliberative and intuitive systems. I'd like to offer the comparison of a deliberative system being like a computer, something where you put a lot of information in, it really thinks about all that data and then spits out something in a result, really logical, rational process. The intuitive system has been described by a few of our human factors researchers in our offices, more like your spidey sense, like you're doing things that are, at the spur of the moment, you're taking that information in very quickly and spitting out a response, maybe not even thinking about it. And I can offer the example of something like planning a route from suburban Chicago to the Loop area, if you're familiar, you might consider a lot of different factors when you're doing that. Maybe you've already decided you're going to go by motor vehicle instead of take the train. In doing that, though, you can think about, do I want to spend a lot of time on the road, but move, with traffic? Do I want to take the most direct route, knowing that I'm going to be interacting with a lot of buildup of traffic along the way? Do I want to eliminate tolls? You're going to think about all these things as you make that decision to pick the route that you want to use. So you contrast that decision-making, which I'd consider that to be more deliberative decision-making, with approaching a yellow light at a traffic signal. You are going to need to make a pretty quick decision about, am I going through this light? Do I have time? Do I need to stop and use my my better judgment maybe and proceed as though I assume that light's going to go red and let traffic cross? That's a spur of the moment decision, something a little bit more intuitive that you're going to have to contend with. And I'd like to offer the example for a moment of, do we think that something like cell phone use while driving is an intuitive decision or a deliberative decision? And oftentimes when we teach this, we'll have a group of people, give a show of hands for each one. I think something like cell phone use while driving can be considered either. I mean, you might consider in advance, I'm going to put my cell phone in a bag in my back seat. I'm going to think through my process for not using my cell phone while driving. However, it might be intuitive when you see your phone light up in your cup holder, perhaps, to reach down and maybe glance at what that says, or type out a quick response. Maybe you're stopped at a traffic signal. So it's not always as cut and dry as it might be. And so sometimes there's a line between that intuitive or deliberative decision making. I also wanted to point out that human behavior is often irrational. Decisions are made using available information and data, but within the context of a lot of other factors. So we know that we need to be eating a lot of fruits and vegetables on a regular basis. We know that we need to get enough sleep. These are things that we know for our personal health. As of the past several weeks, we've all been reminded, hey, we don't need to be touching our faces as much to maintain our own health. But the actual process of putting that into practice is very different. We don't do those things even though we know we should. And that can be true of a lot of our behaviors. It can be irrational. It's not that we don't know we shouldn't do it. We just proceed in the way that we are, and we act on a lot of different factors. It boils down to the fact that human beings are not robots. We take a robot, on the other hand, will take information in, provide some processing of that data, and spit the desired behavior out. Human beings, on the other hand, we can put information in. However, that goes into a lot of other factors as well as, or like social pressure, as well as financial pressure, our habits, our convenience factors, and then the desired behavior. Maybe it'll come out, maybe it won't. We don't always know what humans will do with the information that we give them. So we can be very complex in that way. One example that I point to, and this is used in a lot of marketing literature as well, is about brushing your teeth. We knew for many, many years about the benefits of dental hygiene into the 1800s even. We knew that we were supposed to take care of our teeth. This was even documented during World War I. Poor dental hygiene was documented as a national security concern among Army, enlisted Army members during that time. Yet people knew they were supposed to do it, but they didn't brush their teeth very commonly until about the mid-1900s, when it wasn't knowing that we needed to do it or any scientific data, but it was ad campaigns that focused on things like having stinky breath or film on your teeth as reasons why you should brush your teeth. It wasn't about the health risks of not doing so, but it was the aesthetics and that rewarding, tingly, clean feeling that you might get when you brush your teeth that finally got people to come around to do it. All showing examples of that our behavior is irrational. We should have been brushing our teeth for other reasons, yet this is what we had to do to actually make people make that decision. We also should acknowledge this third principle, which is that human behavior is influenced heavily so by our environment. The environment in this case might refer to our physical environment, but it also includes other things like policies, laws, and social norms that are in place that we operate within. People, as we know, don't just do what you tell them to. They are functions of our environment. And you can consider whether you're driving on these two different roads here. You might think about the one on the left and the one on the right. If you don't post speed limits on these roads, people will drive them very differently. Even though the one on the left may not meet certain roadside design standards in terms of clear zones and whatnot, people might proceed more carefully down the road on the left because of that narrowness, that visual friction. There's narrower lanes even. Whereas the image on the right, it does comply with a lot of our standards and guidelines. However, we've got wide open clear zones. We've got more space in the lane. It might feel more comfortable to travel at a higher speed. So we may see very different behaviors by putting drivers on these two streets, no matter what information we provide to them. Their environment will heavily dictate and drive what behaviors we see. The final principle I wanted to hit on is that humans make mistakes. This intuitive system of decision-making that we use, it usually does work pretty well. We get by quite well with our intuitive decision-making. However, mistakes are inherent in this decision-making system. They are a manifestation of this imperfect decision-making process. So if you think about a condition where you're driving down the street, maybe reacting to your environment, you look down and you're going very fast, too fast for the condition. You might stop yourself and say, whoa, I had no idea I was speeding 10, 15 miles over the speed limit. You didn't do that probably intentionally, although some probably do speed intentionally. A lot of people probably react to their environments and they make a mistake somewhere along that process. Unfortunately, sometimes this could result in a crash or possibly a near miss. You see on the right in this image, a person running a red light. Likely they did not do that intentionally. They could have been distracted leading up to the intersection. They could have been traveling too fast for the conditions. Yet they may merely have made a mistake here and gotten involved in a crash. I don't want to use the word mistake here to suggest that individuals are blameless or that we can't rely somewhat on people using, their being careful behind the wheel, things like that. And I don't want to suggest that these are simply accidents we can brush off. But a mistake is an important tool in road safety decision making. We can use this, and we do often, to understand patterns to better diagnose and solve safety problems. You can consider a collision diagram such as this one produced by the North Carolina DOT. Quickly, if you review the crashes that have happened and the events that have taken place, you can quickly begin to see a pattern emerging. And that can tell us a lot about what can be done in a certain condition to solve that problem. This is simply a pattern of mistakes is what we're witnessing here. These mistakes that people aren't making intentionally, it tells us something about how they're reacting to their environment and how we might go about understanding what can be done to improve conditions here. So again, I wanted to review these principles of behavior. These are guided by two systems. We are often irrational in our decision making. We are heavily influenced by our environments, and we make mistakes. And these are just representations of this imperfect decision-making system that we have. So I'm going to turn it over to Bevan now to talk through how we go about changing human behavior. And Bevan, I think since I have the screen now, you can request control from me, and I'll approve that now. So you should be able to control the slides.
Thank you. Yes, so let me go ahead and start from that great background that both Wes and Dan provided and talk about how do we change human behavior or accommodate human behavior. We kind of understand a little bit more about what makes humans behave the way they do. So let's take that a step further and figure out what are we going to do with that information. So let's see. I'm trying to advance my slide here. Okay, there it goes. So we are all every day subject to a variety of different approaches aimed at changing our behavior, many of which we don't even realize are happening. And these can be things such as laws or policies that are implemented wherever we are, informational brochures. This one talks about the benefits of getting a flu shot, certain policies in different cities that maybe would promote recycling over throwing things away to go to the landfill by providing a larger recycling bin than a garbage bin. Charging for plastic bags as a way to encourage people to bring their own reusable grocery bags. Media campaigns, posters, and things like that, all sharing information about the consequences of some behavior that might happen. And this final one is a donut that shows the calories listed on the menu so that you can make an informed decision about how you want to, how many calories you want to consume that day. And so all of these are approaches to changing our behavior that we experience all of the time. And I'd be remiss to not make note of the current situation that we are all in and how there's a lot going on to change our behavior today. For example, you may have seen things about recommendations that people should wear masks when they're out in public, or recommendations to stay home, or information about how to properly wash your hands and how far away you should be from other people. And all of those are things that perhaps we had never thought about before, but now we're seeing this information out in the world, and that's all influencing what we do. I think many of us have probably learned some new terms in the past few weeks, like social distancing and flatten the curve, and words like that maybe we had never considered before. And beyond just this information, we're also seeing policies being put in place that are having states that are issuing stay-at-home orders to encourage people not to leave unless it's for an essential purpose. And all of this is aimed at changing our behavior. And for this particular case, it's to limit our exposure to this virus that we may come in contact with. So all of these are efforts to change our behavior that we all encounter all the time. And you can see, you can probably think about your own life and how that has changed your behavior right now. I'm talking to you from my home, which normally I would not be there. And you can see we've had technical difficulties and whatnot. And all of that is partly because, this is not our normal way of doing things. And so we're kind of adapting to this new world that we're in. And that's changed our behavior in some ways. So all of these behavior change approaches generally there are generally two different approaches. One is either to provide information to the person, and the second is to change the environment to encourage a desired behavior. So the informational approaches are going to be things like that flu shot brochure, nutrition information, or recommendations about, the face masks. That's all providing information to somebody. The environmental changes, again, doesn't necessarily need to be the built environment. It can be our social norm environment as well. And that's going to be policies and laws, charging for plastic bags. All of that is going to be a change to the environment that encourages us to do a different type of behavior. And generally speaking, when we approach a human behavior problem and want to change a human behavior, we usually reach for the education and awareness tools first. These are generally easier to implement, they're generally less expensive and faster to implement. So generally, this is where people are going to go first. Now, the question is that going to be sufficient for the question at hand? So these informational campaigns assume that humans are rational decision makers. This assumes that we give the person some information, and then because of that information, they will then do whatever the desired behavior is. Those messages very much appeal to the deliberative system rather than the intuitive system. And as Dan pointed out, most of our human behavior is intuitive, not deliberative. So thinking about this as a potential solution, that's not to say that this cannot be useful in some situations, but we also need to be aware of, is a lack of information what is causing our behavior to be the way it is. And one way of thinking about this is to take examples from additional public health fields, kind of step out of our box in order to see what other people have done so that we can apply that to the field of traffic safety. And we're going to do that right now. Most of us are very, very heavily involved in what we do. We're very familiar with what we do. And sometimes it takes kind of stepping outside of our box to understand something a little better. So we're going to go outside of the box and talk about guinea worm disease. Guinea worm disease is a parasitic infection that does occur in certain areas of Africa, and it is caused by drinking water that's contaminated with the guinea worm larva. You can see on the map here the general area of the world that we're looking at. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about this condition, but you can see the general life cycle here. You can see there's a drinking glass, and that's where kind of this cycle starts. A person consumes water that's infected or that's contaminated with the guinea worm larva. It gets into their system. And the key here is that nothing really happens for an entire year. It takes a long time for this process to come about. But after a year, the person starts to have symptoms, and ultimately those symptoms result in a blister, usually on your leg, and the guinea worm emerges from that blister. Now, as you might imagine, that is uncomfortable. It's, can dramatically influence quality of life and things like that. And so it's a very serious condition in the parts of the world that it exists. And so one way that people have found that alleviates kind of the itchiness and the pain associated with this infection is that they put their infected limb kind of in the water source, and that will make it feel better. But in doing so, it contaminates the water, which then leads to somebody drinking it, and we kind of have this circle around and around. So we can talk about guinea worm as a great example of how we can approach problems in the world. So in 1986, there were 3.5 million cases of guinea worm disease in the world. In 2019, there were 54. That on its own is just a phenomenal decrease. But if you take into account that there are no known medications or vaccines that prevent or cure this disease, and that entire decrease was done through behavior change, this is just a phenomenal public health accomplishment. And it would be wise of us in other fields to look at the successes here and apply those to our worlds as well. So how do we change human behavior? What do we do here? So number one, we need to identify what is the behavior that we're trying to change. And beyond that, what are the factors that are contributing to that behavior? So in the case of guinea worm disease, we have two behaviors that we can target that can kind of break this circle here. Number one is drinking water that is contaminated. And number two is using the water source as a way of relieving pain. Those are the two behaviors. But we have to go beyond that. We have to understand why those behaviors are occurring. What's contributing to those behaviors? Uh-oh. All right.
Sorry, Bevan. Let me.
I'm still in control here. Let me just scroll down.
Okay.
Let's see if I can fix this. Okay, we're back in business. Okay, so what are the factors that are contributing to this behavior? So why are people drinking the contaminated water? Well, if we break that down, we're in a part of the world where perhaps the water is limited in its availability. There was maybe a lack of understanding about how the disease was transmitted and kind of how drinking the water would play a role in that. People maybe didn't have the financial resources to get different water sources. And there was a lack of immediate consequences. As I mentioned, you drink the water and then a year later you have symptoms. So it's really far away for there to be a kind of a cause and effect linkage there. So what about why are people using the water sources to relieve their pain? Well, again, there's a limited availability of water. The drinking water sources that's what's available. So they're going to use what they have available to them. And there's also a lack of alternate treatments. If they don't have, the medical infrastructure or whatnot in place to seek out additional pain relief or something like that, then they're going to use the tools that they have available to them. Again, there could have been a lack of understanding in terms of how this disease is transmitted. And most importantly, there was an immediate benefit. If you're in pain and this is a way of solving that problem, then obviously that's going to be what people do to solve their problem and make themselves feel better. So we've identified these contributing factors, and these are the things that are contributing to why people are doing the behavior that we're trying to target. So let's ask ourselves, we talked about how generally speaking, we reach towards education first. Is education enough in this situation? Well, that's going to solve two of our problems, which is that there was a lack of understanding, but it's not going to increase the availability of water, the availability of alternate treatments and things like that. So that on its own is not going to be enough to change the behavior. It needed to be a more comprehensive approach. And in the case of guinea worm, I'm boiling down 30 plus years of significant effort into one slide. And I encourage you, if you are interested in this, the Carter Foundation was heavily involved, and there's lots of information on their website about exactly what was done. But to boil it down to just one single slide, there certainly was an informational component where community health workers shared information with the community to make sure everybody understood their role in this process. But beyond that, they had to go and change the environment. They had to make the environment such that the people in these communities could do the desired behavior. And this is through providing ways for people to access safe water. The gentleman on the top is drinking water out of a filtration device. It's a little straw. And some of you may be familiar with the Life straw, which came about as part of this process. There's another way of filtering water in a picture below, and also kind of changing this societal norms so that people who had an infection, instead of treating it on their own, would then go to the community health workers, identify if water sources were contaminated and things like that. So it changed the structure overall so that people could make these changes and make the behavior change that we wanted. So the information plus the environment was key in this situation. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dan to talk about a traffic safety example.
All right, thanks, Bevan. I'm hoping that I don't break anything, so hold tight. All right, hopefully you can see this screen here, and we're going to walk through sort of an application of this process that Bevan laid out on a case example. This is fictional, but you could think of this coming up in any of your communities, I'm sure. And I'll also mention that the graphics I'm taking for this come from an excellent animation that was developed by Mike Wilson, Commuter Orlando blog down there. It kind of looks at crosswalk use. So there's a link at the bottom if you want to type it in at any point. We're going to talk about Elm Street, is what we named this street. And at Elm Street, there's a particular location where there's a bus stop on one side of the street and a really popular shopping center on the other side. People use this for all sorts of different reasons at all times of day. There are intersections in just a few hundred feet from this location in either direction. But what most commonly happens when people get off the bus is they just go right across the street. They cross here. They have a median to use, which is really nice to improve their crossing. They go over to shop, and then they make their way back. And unfortunately, over the years, there have been a number of near-miss events and even some crashes that have happened, resulting in at least one fatality. So the community is really concerned about this location. They want to do something about it. So what they decided to do is to start with this question of, what behavior do we really want to target here? What are we concerned about most? And for them, the answer was a crossing at mid-block on Elm Street. They wanted to figure this behavior out and address this concern. For now, though, they're not really worried about this other question. Not going to ask themselves that. They're going to think about, what do we want to fix? Come up with a solution. And what they decided on is this informational campaign. They developed these graphics that have this catchy little tagline. It's called a crosswalk, not a cross wherever. And what they did is they came up with some tips for pedestrians to go along with this. Posters and flyers, they did it in a few different languages so people could access the information no matter where they're coming from. They posted them at the bus stop. They distributed them at the shopping center. And they even got the media to cover the campaign to really increase visibility. All kind of shining some light on this issue, and this is the proposed solution that they had to this problem. So the question for us is, will this work? Do we think that this is going to be an effective strategy at solving this problem? From our perspective, we don't think so. On its own, this may not be the thing that really solves this issue and reduces the safety problem or improves the safety problem. We've been trying this strategy for about 100 years now. You see an example of a pedestrian tip card from 1921 that was handed out to pedestrians to try to get them to use crosswalks and not cross where they found it to be most convenient or where they needed to cross. So if it hasn't worked in 100 years, it likely is not going to be an effective solution in this case. What we really need to do is think through this problem a bit more deeply and come up with a solution that works. One thing that you want to consider that the animation I mentioned really plays out is, why is it exactly that pedestrians are crossing where they are? After they did this campaign, they handed out these tip flyers. Some of the pedestrians tried what they said. They said, okay, that's fine. We'll go cross. We're going to cross at that intersection like you want us to. So as they step through the animation, the pedestrian kind of comes down the sidewalk here and approaches this intersection. You can see him coming up on it. A lot of lanes to cross. They finally get there. They've got a complex set of traffic signals to work with here. A lot of different phases, vehicles coming in either direction, a lot of turn lanes. So the pedestrian's going to sit there, they're going to wait for these left-turning vehicles to cross and do their thing. Finally, they get the green light, but then as soon as they do, they have a right-turning vehicle turns right in front of them as they're starting this crossing. Not something you want to encounter, but you know, just a minor hiccup in the path. So they brush it off. They continue to go down the street. They make it about halfway across before you can notice that the cross street's getting the yellow light. The pedestrian doesn't have much time to get across. Not a lot of time devoted for this crossing here. Once they get stuck in the street, they are almost across when these right-turning vehicles, making their legal right on red in this situation, begin to turn in front of them. The pedestrian's still out there in the road, didn't have time to get across. Finally, they make it across. They make their way down the sidewalk, only to find that the bus has departed and gone on its way, and they miss their ride. So you ask yourself the question, why don't pedestrians go down to cross at the intersection? Why do they cross mid-block? Are they just lazy? Do they have no regard for traffic rules at all? I think we can see on this particular route, at least, numerous reasons why, if you tried that thing, you may not want to do it again. And so what we ask ourselves then with these two questions now, we go back and we say, we do want to address this mid-block crossing on Elm Street, but we want to understand what other factors are influencing that behavior. One of them is convenience. The crossing is right there across from the shopping center. That path that they had to walk down to the intersection was a bit out of the way, and they may not want to do that on a regular basis. That past experience, they tried to do this once, and they ran into so many different conflicts, so many different inconveniences there, and they ended up missing the bus. That wasn't a positive experience. Likely someone's going to remember that and base their future decision-making on it. Finally, there is a time pressure factor here. It gets back to convenience, but the person's trying to get home, and if that's your only ride, maybe for 30, 45 minutes, you're going to be sure that you're going to make it across the street to get to your bus on time. So these are all factors, and possibly there are others that need to be incorporated into the decision-making. So it could be that there's some useful information that the people shopping and that people riding the bus could benefit from if it were distributed to them in flyer form, in PSAs, maybe at the bus stop. But that can't be the only solution to this problem, and it likely won't work unless there's some work that goes into changing the environment. So we can offer a few ideas of doing some things to the environment here. What about making a safe crossing at the location where people are already crossing? We often get questions about where is the ideal place to put a pedestrian crossing? And the easiest way to figure this out is look at where people are going across the street. Does it make sense for people to cross here if there's a bus on one side of the street and a shopping center on the other side? And if so, design it in such a way that people can get on and off the bus, cross the crosswalk behind the bus so their vision isn't impaired to the vehicles coming left, for example, and make that a safe crossing. Do what you need to do to really beef up that crossing, put in some things that'll increase vehicle compliance, driver compliance with the yielding laws. You might also think about another environmental factor, which is that it gets at that convenience issue, but it's where that bus stop is located in the first place. In working with the transit agency, it could be possible that by doing some reworking to the route, it makes more sense in some cases for the bus stop to be placed at that intersection. We know some benefits to those both near and far side stops at intersections, and those mid-block crossings and those stops can be fairly inconvenient in some cases. So if we did some work to notify the transit users and then maybe move that bus stop, we're making it more direct and more convenient for them to actually use the crossing that we'd like them to cross at. We make that right behavior become the easy choice in this case. So people can then use this crosswalk. It makes more sense for them to do so. And that's some of that behavior that we want to see right there. We can't ignore the fact that that intersection was pretty perilous and had some hazards associated with it. So we need to think about that past experience that people had and really solve some of those problems as well. One of the things we noticed is that pedestrians crossing at this location didn't have enough time to get across the street. They were cut off by that right-turning vehicle as soon as the light turned green. So to solve that problem, we might consider something like a leading pedestrian interval, where pedestrian is given the light to walk. Vehicles are held, but we're going to restrict right turns on red in this case. We're going to allow pedestrians to establish themselves in the crosswalk before releasing the vehicle traffic, allowing the pedestrians a little extra time to establish themselves, get across the street, and actually make it to the other side before those vehicles can interfere with their path. This is a solution that's happening all over the country. It's one thing, I wouldn't say it's the only thing that had to happen at that intersection, but it's one thing that could work and make that experience much more pleasant and more safe for the pedestrians using the crosswalk. The final thing might be, if we're thinking about providing some information to people, what if we provided them some information about their transit route, the time pressure issue? We might think about putting some real-time bus information up at the shopping center and at the bus stop itself, so people can see when their bus is coming and maybe make some advanced plans about getting there on time. You know, if we're thinking through providing that information to people, this is some information that actually really could benefit them and could help them make that travel a little bit safer. So these are all things we'd want to think through in this example, not just providing the tips to them and telling them what to do, but giving them some on-the-ground solutions to make those decisions easier and make them more natural for people using them. And I think we have better success in solving this problem on Elm Street. So what Bevan's going to do is kind of review an example of how this has been successful in North Carolina with another traffic safety example. Have you still got control? Yep. You might still be on mute, Bevan.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can,
Yes.
yep.
Okay, good. I'm sorry, I lost the ability to unmute myself. So all kinds of fun challenges today. So let's talk about an approach that we've looked at as far as seatbelt use in North Carolina. This is an example of an effective behavior change. And if you'll notice, this takes on a similar timeline from what we talked about with guinea worm disease. In the early 80s in North Carolina, well, first let's start with the 60s and 70s. That's when seatbelts were required by federal law to be in vehicles. So we've had seatbelts available for a very long time in our vehicles. But historically, not many people used them in those early years until a law kind of came into place requiring their use. In North Carolina, that law went into effect in the mid-80s, 85. And for the first 2 years of that law enforcement were only writing warnings. So from 85 to 87, it was warnings only. And you can see what happened when tickets started being written. People went all the way up. The seatbelt use rate started around 25% and went all the way up to around 70% when tickets went into effect. But as you can see after that, kind of in the late 80s, early 90s, there was this dip, and maybe people realized that law enforcement couldn't see them all the time. Maybe they could get away with not wearing their seatbelts sometimes. And so that suggested that some additional approaches might be necessary. And North Carolina was the first state to implement click it or ticket. And that went into effect in the early 90s. And you can see since then, we've been doing this kind of slow upward climb towards 90%. And that's kind of where we are now at 90%. And you can see this is an example that behavior change can happen, but it takes a long time. It took 30 years, not 30 minutes, to get from 25% up to 90% of seatbelt use. And so that involved law changes, that involved policy changes, it involved information and all of that. And so all of that came into play to achieve this goal. So what we want to leave you with is behavior change is hard. It's very difficult, but it's possible. So we leave you with that charge of thinking through these behaviors and making sure that you're targeting them in the best way possible so that you can have that effective behavior change in your communities to target whatever problem that you're seeing. So with that, we are right at the end of our time here. So I think I'm going to pass it back to Eugene for our closing remarks.
All right, thank you very much, Bevan. And I want to thank Bevan and Wes and Dan all for today's presentation, and for everyone who's joined us today. Since we are running tight on time and there aren't any questions in the queue, I'm going to go ahead and begin my closing comments, but we will, after we officially end and stop the recording, please continue to use the question and answer window to ask any comment, share any additional comments, ask any other questions we can answer for you offline, or to share suggestions about today's webinar or future webinar topics. We would very much appreciate your feedback. Certainly, if we were unable to get to a question for you today, we'll do our best to get a response to you as soon as possible. Do watch your email for follow-up message from us after today's webinar. We'll send out the recording link to you as well in case anyone missed any part of today's presentation, and the link will be again posted online for your viewing. Thank you. It looks like we've got some comments coming in. We really appreciate that. A note about certificates. If you are a professional engineer and you participated today in the live webinar, not watching the recording later, but if you were part of our live webinar, we do have a certificate for you which we'll send out that's going to award 1 PDH credit for your continuing education requirements. Because we have a large volume of participants, we would ask if you're not a PE but you want a certificate, we're happy to provide one for you. Just reply to the follow-up email that you receive and let us know, yes, I'd like to get a certificate. We'll send one right out to you. But we have over 100 participants today, so it would take a while to generate 100 certificates. So if you need one, we're happy to send it to you. Just let us know in replying to the email. More training is available for you by webinars. And so we invite you to join us for other traffic safety webinars we've already got planned for this series. So if you'll please visit our website at the link on your screen for a list of our upcoming webinars. We also are planning some in-person training workshops. Obviously, in-person training is on hiatus right now due to the COVID-19 situation, but as soon as those travel restrictions and meeting restrictions end later this year, we anticipate having some other live training, face-to-face training opportunities. Those will also be posted on this same website. And then also at the same website, we invite you to learn more about the North Carolina Traffic Safety Conference and Expo if you're not already familiar with it. Our next conference will be coming up in August of 2021. You'll find lots of information about what the conference is about, and go ahead and mark your calendars, and hopefully you'll plan to attend to that. In particular, if you're interested in presenting at the conference, there is a presentation proposals link on this website. So we welcome you to submit and propose topics to present at the conference. So with that, I want to say thank you all again for participating in today's webinar, and goodbye for now.